The saxophone is a family of woodwind instruments. Saxophones are usually made of brass and played with a single reed mouthpiece similar to that of the clarinet. The saxophone family was invented by the Belgian instrument maker Adolphe Sax in 1840. Sax wanted to create a group or series of instruments that would be the most powerful and vocal of the woodwinds, and the most adaptive of the brass that would fill the vacant middle ground between the two sections. He patented the saxophone on June 28, 1846, in two groups of 7 instruments each. Each series consisted of instruments of various sizes in alternating transposition. The series pitched in bar and registered trademark and A and registered trademark, designed for military bands, has proved extremely popular, and most saxophones encountered today are from the series. Instruments from the so-called orchestral series, pitched in C and F, never gained a foothold, and the bar and registered trademark and A and registered trademark instruments have now replaced the C and F instruments in classical music. The saxophone is commonly used in classical music, military bands, marching bands, and jazz. Saxophone players are called saxophonists. History: the saxophone was developed in 1841, by Adolphe Sax, a Belgian instrument maker, flautist, and clarinetist working in Paris. While still working at his father's instrument shop in Brussels, Sax began developing an instrument with the projection of a brass instrument and the agility of a woodwind. He wanted it to overblow at the octave, unlike the clarinet, which rises in pitch by a twelfth when overblown. An instrument that overblew at the octave would have identical fingering for both registers. Prior to his work on the saxophone, Sax had made several improvements to the bass clarinet by improving its keywork and acoustics and extending its lower range. Sax was also a maker of the then popular ophicleide, a large conical brass instrument in the bass register with keys similar to a woodwind instrument. His experience with these two instruments allowed him to develop the skills and technologies needed to make the first saxophones. Adolphe Sax created an instrument with a single reed mouthpiece like a clarinet, conical brass body like an ophicleide, and the acoustic properties of both the French horn and the clarinet. Having constructed saxophones in several sizes in the early 1840s, Sax applied for, and received, a 15-year patent for the instrument on June 28, 1846. The patent encompassed 14 versions of the fundamental design, split into 2 categories of 7 instruments each, and ranging from soprano to contrabass. Although the instruments transposed at either F or C have been considered orchestral, there is no evidence that Sax intended this. As only 3% of Sax's surviving production were pitched in F and C, and as contemporary composers used the A and registered trademark alto and bar and registered trademark bass saxophone freely in orchestral music, it is almost certain that Sax experimented to find the most suitable keys for these instruments, settling upon instruments alternating between A and registered trademark and bar and registered trademark rather than those pitched in F or C, for reasons of tone and economy. The C-soprano saxophone was the only instrument to sound at concert pitch. All the instruments were given an initial written range from the B below the treble staff to the F, 1 space above the 3 ledger lines above staff, giving each saxophone a range of 2.5 octaves. Sax's patent expired in 1866. Thereafter, numerous saxophonists and instrument manufacturers implemented their own improvements to the design and keywork. The first substantial modification was by a French manufacturer who extended the bell slightly and added an extra key to extend the range downwards by 1 semitone to bar and registered trademark. It is suspected that Sax himself may have attempted this modification. This extension is now commonplace in almost all modern designs, along with other minor changes such as added keys for alternate fingerings. Sax's original keywork, which was based on the triplet system 3 oboe for the left hand and the Bohème clarinet for the right, was very simplistic and made playing some legato passages and wide intervals extremely difficult to finger, so numerous developers added extra keys and alternate fingerings to make chromatic playing less difficult. While the early saxophone had 2 separate octave vents to assist in the playing of the upper registers just as modern instruments do, players of Sax's original design had to operate these via 2 separate octave keys operated by the left thumb. A substantial advancement in saxophone keywork was the development of a method by which the left thumb operates both tone holes with a single octave key, which is now universal on modern saxophones. One of the most radical, however temporary, revisions of saxophone keywork was made in the 1950s by Aimar Uvenagel of Paris, who completely redeveloped the mechanics of the system to allow a number of notes to be flattened by a semitone simply by lowering the right middle finger. This enables a chromatic scale to be played over 2 octaves simply by playing the diatonic scale combined with alternately raising and lowering this one digit. However, this keywork never gained much popularity, and is no longer in use. Uses for the saxophone. Uses in military bands and classical music. The saxophone first gained popularity in one of the uses it was designed for, the military band. Although the instrument was studiously ignored in Germany at first, French and Belgian military bands took full advantage of the instrument that Sax had designed. Most French and Belgian military bands incorporate at least a quartet of saxophones comprising at least the A-registered trademark baritone, bar-registered trademark tenor, A-registered trademark alto and bar-registered trademark soprano. These 4 instruments have proved the most popular of all of Sax's creations, with the A-registered trademark contrabass and bar-registered trademark bass usually considered impractically large and the A-registered trademark soprano insufficiently powerful. British military bands tend to include at minimum 2 saxophonists on the alto and tenor. Today, the saxophone is used in military bands all around the world. The saxophone was subsequently introduced into the concert band, which generally calls for the A-registered trademark alto saxophone, the bar-registered trademark tenor saxophone, and the A-registered trademark baritone saxophone. The typical high-level concert band includes 2 altos, 1 tenor, and 1 baritone. The bar-registered trademark soprano saxophone is also occasionally used, in which case it is normally played by the first alto saxophonist. The bass saxophone in bar-registered trademark is called for in some concert band music. The saxophone is used in chamber music, such as the saxophone quartet, reed quintet, and other chamber combinations of instruments. The classical saxophone quartet consists of the soprano saxophone, alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, and baritone saxophone. There is a repertoire of classical compositions and arrangements for the SATB instrumentation dating back to the 19th century, particularly by French composers who knew Adolphe Sax. Classical saxophone quartets include Quatuor Habanera, the H2 Quartet, Rashoa Saxophone Quartet, the Aurelia Saxophone Quartet, the Mana Quartet, the New Century Saxophone Quartet, and others. Historically, the quartets led by Marcel Mule and Daniel D. Fayette, saxophone professors at the Conservatoire de Paris, were started in 1928 and 1953, respectively, and were highly regarded. The Mule Quartet is often considered the prototype for future quartets, due the level of virtuosity demonstrated by its members and its central role in the development of the quartet repertoire. However, organized quartets did exist before Mule's ensemble, the prime example being the quartet headed by Edouard Liefbras, former soloist with the Sousa Band, in the United States c. 1904–1911. Other ensembles most likely existed at this time as part of the saxophone sections of the many touring professional bands that existed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The saxophone is a member of the reed quintet. The reed quintet consists of an oboe, a clarinet, a saxophone, a bass clarinet, and a bassoon. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the saxophone has found increased popularity in the symphony orchestra. In one or other size, the instrument has also been found as a useful accompaniment to genres as wide-ranging as opera and choral music. Many musical theatre scores include parts for the saxophone, sometimes doubling another woodwind or brass instrument. In this way, the sax serves as a middle point between other woodwinds and the brass section, helping to blend the two sections. Selected works of the repertoire. Selected saxophone quartets. Selected orchestral pieces that include saxophone, s. Uses in jazz and popular music. The saxophone is also commonly used in jazz music, where the saxophone is one of the signature sounds. Beginning in the early 20th century, the saxophone became popular in big bands, which typically includes 2 altos, 2 tenors and 1 baritone. The saxophone also often appears as a solo instrument with a rhythm section either alone or with other lead instruments. The alto sax was popularized in jazz music in the 1940s and 1950s by the pioneering virtuosity of Charlie Parker, whose bebop style of playing would deeply influence the next 2 generations of jazz musicians, in particular saxophonists. The alto sax was also popularized in the 1950s by top saxophonists such as Sonny Stitt, Cannonball Adderley, Sonny Criss and Paul Desmond. The tenor sax, which some consider to be the more popular form of saxophone as a solo instrument in jazz, was popularized by jazz greats such as Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, Stan Getz and Zoot Sims. The baritone sax, featured more in big bands and larger ensembles than as a solo instrument, was popularized in jazz as a solo instrument within small groups by musicians such as Serge Shaloff, Jerry Mulligan, Pepper Adams and Leo Parker. The soprano saxophone was popularized by Sidney Bechet in early jazz, but then largely fell out of favor on the jazz scene until John Coltrane began to feature the instrument. The jazz saxophone quartet is usually made up of 1 bar in registered trademark soprano, 1 A in registered trademark alto, 1 bar in registered trademark tenor and 1 A in registered trademark baritone. On occasion, the soprano is replaced with a second alto sax. A few professional saxophone quartets have featured non-standard instrumentation, such as James Fahey's Alto Quartet and Jaime Bluet's Bluet Baritone Nation. Recently, the World Saxophone Quartet has become known as the preeminent jazz saxophone quartet. The saxophone, as a solo instrument or as part of a horn section, may also be heard in blues, soul music, rhythm and blues, reggae, ska, funk, rock and roll and other forms of popular music. Some players of these genres include King Curtis, Maceo Parker, Bobby Keys, Clarence Clemons, the Memphis Horns, and the Phoenix Horns. The saxophone family. The primary saxophone family alternates instruments and bar in registered trademark and A in registered trademark. The other family patented by Sax, alternating instruments in C and F, has always been marginal, although some manufacturers tried to popularize the soprano in C, the alto in F, and the tenor in C early in the 20th century. The C melody enjoyed some success in the late 1920s and early 1930s as a parlor instrument. One company has recently revived production of the C soprano and C melody. Instruments in F are rare. Description: the saxophone consists of an approximately conical tube of thin brass, sometimes plated with silver, gold, or nickel, flared at the tip to form a bell. At intervals along the tube are between 20 and 23 tone holes of varying size, including 2 very small speaker holes to assist the playing of the upper register. These holes are covered by keys, containing soft leather pads, which are closed to produce an airtight seal. At rest some of the holes stand open and others are closed. The keys are controlled by buttons pressed by the fingers, while the right thumb sits under a thumb rest to help keep the saxophone balanced. The fingering for the saxophone is a combination of that of the oboe with the Boeheim system, and is very similar to the flute or the upper register of the clarinet. Instruments that play to low A have a left thumb key for the note. The simplest design of saxophone is a straight conical tube, and the soprano and soprano saxophones are usually of this straight design. However, as the lower-pitched instruments would be unacceptably long if straight, for ergonomic reasons, the larger instruments usually incorporate a U-bend at, or slightly above, the third lowest tone hole. As this would cause the bell of the instrument to point almost directly upward, the end of the instrument is either beveled or tilted slightly forward. This U-shape has become a distinctive feature of the saxophone family, to the extent that soprano and even soprano saxes are sometimes made in the curved style, even though not strictly necessary. By contrast, tenors and even baritones have occasionally been made in the straight style. Most commonly, however, the alto and tenor saxophones incorporate a curved crook above the highest tone hole but below the top speaker hole, tilting the mouthpiece through 90 degrees. The baritone, bass and contrabass extend the length of the bore by triple folding this section. Materials: most saxophones, both past and present, are made from brass. Despite this, they are categorized as woodwind instruments rather than brass, as the sound waves are produced by an oscillating wood reed, not the player's lips against a mouthpiece as in a brass instrument, and because different pitches are produced by breath when passing opening and closing keys. The screw pins that connect the rods to the posts, as well as the needle and leaf springs that cause the keys to return to their rest position after being released, are generally made of blued or stainless steel. Since 1920, most saxophones have key touches made from either plastic or mother-of-pearl. Other materials have been tried with varying degrees of success, such as the 1950s grafting plastic alto saxophone and its recent successor, the polycarbonate saxophone, vibrato sax. There is also the wooden sword saxophone created in Thailand on a small scale. A few companies, such as Yanagijor and Bauhaus Wallstein, have made some saxophone models from phosphor bronze because of his slightly different tonal qualities. For example, although their designs are identical apart from the metal used, the bronze Yanagijor A992 saxophones are said to sound darker than the brass versions. Yanagijor and other manufacturers, starting with the King Super 20 around 1950, have made saxophone necks, bells, or entire instruments from sterling silver. Keyleth and P. Moriarty have made saxes with a nickel-silver body like that of a flute. The effect of material on sound is controversial among sax players, and little solid research has been published. After completing the instrument, the manufacturers usually apply a thin coating of clear or colored acrylic lacquer, or silver plate, over the bare brass. The lacquer or plating serves to protect the brass from oxidation, and maintains its shiny appearance. Several different types and colors of surface finish have been used over the years. It is also possible to plate the instrument with nickel or gold, and a number of gold-plated saxophones have been produced. Plating saxophones with gold is an expensive process because gold does not adhere directly to brass. As a result, the brass is first plated with silver, then gold. Some argue that the type of lacquer or plating, or absence thereof, may enhance an instrument's tone quality. The possible effects of different finishes on tone is a hotly debated topic, not least because other variables may affect an instrument's tone colors, for example mouthpiece design and physical characteristics of the player. In any case, what constitutes a pleasing tone is a matter of personal preference. Mouthpiece and reed. The saxophone uses a single reed mouthpiece similar to that of the clarinet. Most saxophonists use reeds made from Arondodonax cane, but since the 20th century some have also been made of fiberglass and other composite materials. The saxophone mouthpiece is larger than that of the clarinet, has a wider inner chamber, and lacks the cork-covered tenon of a clarinet mouthpiece because the saxophone neck inserts into the mouthpiece whereas the clarinet mouthpiece piece is inserted into the barrel. The most important difference between a saxophone embouchure and a clarinet embouchure is that the saxophone mouthpiece should enter the mouth at a much lower or flatter angle than the clarinet. The embouchure for clarinet must also be more firm than that for saxophone. The muscles in the lip and jaw develop naturally, the more one plays, and the long tones exercise helps a great deal with this aspect of playing. Mouthpieces come in a wide variety of materials, including vulcanized rubber, plastic, and metals such as bronze or surgical steel. Less common materials that have been used include wood, glass, crystal, porcelain, and even bone. According to Larry Teal, the mouthpiece material has little, if any, effect on the sound, and the physical dimensions give a mouthpiece its tone color. Mouthpiece design has a profound impact on tone. Mouthpieces designed for classical playing commonly help to produce a warm and round sound, while mouthpieces designed for jazz playing commonly help to produce a more edgy and bright sound. Mouthpieces with a concave chamber and little to no baffle are more true to Adolphe Sax's original design. These provide a softer or less piercing tone, and are favored by some saxophonists, including students of Sigurd Raschier, for classical playing. Saxophonists who follow the French school of classical saxophone playing, influenced by Marcel Mule, generally use mouthpieces with smaller chambers than Rascher-style mouthpieces, but they still have little to no baffle. Conversely, mouthpieces with a smaller chamber and a lower clearance above the reed, called high baffle, produce a brighter sound with maximum projection and are favored by many jazz and funk players. Most saxophonists who play both jazz and classical music have different equipment for each style. Like clarinets, saxophones use a single reed. Saxophone reeds are proportioned slightly differently from clarinet reeds, being wider for the same length, although some soprano saxophonists use clarinet reeds on the soprano saxophone. Each size of saxophone uses a different size of reed. Reeds are commercially available in a vast array of brands, styles, and strengths. Players experiment with reeds of different strength and material to find which strength and cut suits their mouthpiece, embouchure, tendencies, and playing style. Unusual saxophone variants. A number of saxes and saxophone-related instruments have appeared since Sax's original work, most with no significant success. These include the saxlow, essentially a straight bar and registered trademark soprano, but with a slightly curved neck and tipped bell. The straight alto. And the straight bar and registered trademark tenor. Since a straight ball tenor is approximately 5 feet long, the cumbersome size of such a design makes it almost impossible to either play or transport. King saxlows, made by the H.N. White Company in the 1920s, now command prices up to $4,000. A number of companies, including Keyleth, Rampone and Kazani, LA Sax and Sax Dakota USA, are marketing straight bore, tipped bell soprano saxophones as saxlows. The contralto saxophone, similar in size to the orchestral soprano, was developed in the late 20th century by California instrument maker Jim Schmidt. This instrument is a larger bore and a new fingering system, and does not resemble the C melody instrument except for its key and register. Another new arrival to the sax scene is the soprano sax, a piccolo-sized straight instrument with the upper speaker hole built into the mouthpiece. The instrument, which extends sax's original family, as it is pitched a full octave higher than the bar and registered trademark soprano sax, is manufactured by Benedikt Pelchim, of Munich, Germany. There is a rare prototype slide tenor saxophone, but few were ever made. One company that produced a slide soprano saxophone was Rifle and Husted, Chicago, circa 1922. Two of these variants were championed by jazz musician Razan Roland Kirk, who called his straight Buescher alto a stritch and his modified saxlow a manzolo. The latter featured a larger-than-usual bell and modified key work. Among some saxophonists, Kirk's terms have taken on a life of their own in that it is believed that these were special, or new saxophones that might still be available. Though rare, the Buescher straight alto was a production item instrument while the manzolo was indeed a saxlow with a custom-made bell. Another unusual variant of the saxophone was the Conno sax, a straight conical bore instrument in F with a slightly curved neck and spherical bell. The instrument, which combined a saxophone bore and keys with a bell shaped similar to that of a hexaphone, was intended to imitate the timbre of the English horn and was produced only in 1929 and 1930. The instrument had a key range from low A to high G. Fewer than 100 Conno saxes are in existence, and they are eagerly sought by collectors. The tubax, developed in 1999 by the German instrument maker Benedikt Pelchim, plays the same range, and with the same fingering, as the A and registered trademark contrabass saxophone. Its bore, however, is narrower than that of a contrabass saxophone, making for a more compact instrument with a reedier tone. It can be played with a smaller baritone saxophone mouthpiece and reeds. Pelchim has also produced subcontrabass tubaxes in C and bar and registered trademark, the latter being the lowest saxophone ever made. Among the most recent developments is the Arlock Rome, a double soprano saxophone invented by Belgian instrument maker Frena Section Louis in 2001. Related instruments. Although not true saxophones, inexpensive keyless folk versions of the saxophone made of bamboo were developed in the 20th century by instrument makers in Hawaii, Jamaica, Thailand, Indonesia, Ethiopia, and Argentina. The Hawaiian instrument, called saxophone, was invented during the 1970s and is also marketed as a bamboo sax, although its cylindrical bore more closely resembles that of a clarinet, and its lack of any keywork makes it more akin to a recorder. Jamaica's best-known exponent of a similar type of homemade bamboo saxophone was the Mento musician and instrument maker Sugar Belly. In the Minahasa region of the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, there exist entire bands made up of bamboo saxophones and brass instruments of various sizes. These instruments are imitations of European instruments, made using local materials. Very similar instruments are produced in Thailand. In Argentina, Angel San Pedro del Rayo and Mariana Garca have produced bamboo saxophones of various sizes since 1985, the larger of which have bamboo keys to allow for the playing of lower notes. Audio composition. Music for most saxophones is usually notated using treble clef. The standard written range extends from a bar and registered trademark below the staff to an F or far and registered trademark 3 ledger lines above the staff. Most, if not all, intermediate and professional saxophones made today are built with far unregistered trademark keys, with far unregistered trademark included on even student instruments. There are many models of soprano saxophone that have a key for high G, and most modern models of baritone saxophone have an extended bore and key to produce low A. It is also possible to play a low A on any saxophone by blocking the end of the bell, usually with the foot or inside of the left thigh. Low A keys, however, were not limited to just the baritone saxophone. For a short time Selma Paris produced Mark VI alto saxophones with the low A key. Notes above F are considered part of the altissimo register of any sax, and can be produced using advanced embouchure techniques and fingering combinations. Sax himself had mastered these techniques. He demonstrated the instrument as having a range of just beyond 3 octaves up to a high B4. Modern saxophone players have extended this range to over 4 octaves on tenor and alto. Because all saxophones use the same key arrangement and fingering to produce a given notated pitch, it is not difficult for a competent player to switch among the various sizes when the music has been suitably transposed, and many do so. Since the baritone and alto are pitched in a unregistered trademark, players can read concert pitch music notated in the bass clef by reading it as if it were treble clef and adding 3 sharps to the key signature. This process, referred to as clef substitution, makes it possible for the baritone to play from parts written for bassoon, tuba, trombone, or string bass. This can be useful if a band or orchestra lacks one of those instruments. Gallery. Notes. References. External links. Instruments in Depth, The Saxophone, an online feature with video demonstrations from Bloomingdale School of Music.